August 9, 1965. The air in the recording studio is heavy, stifling, and thick with cigarette smoke. A man sits before a television camera, dressed in immaculate white. This is Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore. In a moment, he is about to announce the ultimate victory for any nationalist leader: absolute, sovereign independence. But he isn't smiling. He pauses, his voice cracks, and on live television, he begins to weep. We're conditioned to think of independence as a glorious sunrise, a moment won through heroic battles, treaties signed with golden pens, or flags raised by cheering crowds. But history is rarely that clean. Sometimes, a nation is born not because it fought to be free, but because it was kicked out. Sometimes, a revolution starts because of a catchy song in an opera house. And sometimes, a country is invented simply because a foreign superpower wants to dig a ditch. To understand the fragility of the borders we see on maps today, we have to look at the moments when the script went off the rails. We start with that man weeping in the studio. To understand his tears, you have to understand the sheer desperation of 1960s Southeast Asia. Singapore is a tiny island with no natural resources, not even enough fresh water. For Lee Kuan Yew, survival meant only one thing: merger. In 1963, he had successfully campaigned to join the Federation of Malaysia. It was supposed to be the economic lifeline that would secure Singapore's future. But the marriage was a disaster from day one. The political leadership in Kuala Lumpur was Malay-dominated and conservative. Lee Kuan Yew's government in Singapore was fiercely multiracial and aggressive. Ideological cracks turned into literal fractures. In 1964, two separate race riots tore through Singapore, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured. The trust was gone. The Malaysian Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, decided that the only way to avoid a bloodbath was amputation. He would cut Singapore loose. On that fateful August morning, the Malaysian Parliament gathered. There was no referendum for the people of Singapore, no negotiations. The vote to expel Singapore was 126-0. When Lee Kuan Yew went on air, he wasn't crying tears of joy. He was mourning the death of his dream. He later called it a moment of anguish. Singapore became the only country in modern history to gain independence against its own will. It was an orphan nation, forced to succeed because the alternative was starvation. That expulsion, which felt like a death sentence, became the catalyst for one of the most rapid economic ascents the world has ever seen. But while Singapore was forced out, half a world away, and a century earlier, another nation was born because an audience got a little too carried away by the arts. The year is 1830. The place is Brussels. At the time, what we now call Belgium was the southern wing of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. The locals were Catholic, French-speaking, and increasingly tired of their Protestant, Dutch-speaking king, William I. The atmosphere was tense, but it wasn't violent. Until the night of August 25th, the occasion was a performance of the opera La Meute des Portici at the Theatre de la Monnaie. It's a dramatic story about a Neapolitan uprising against Spanish rule. The theatre was packed. The air was electric. During the second act, the tenor stepped forward to sing the Sacred Love duet, which includes the line, "Sacred love of the fatherland, give us courage and pride." It was just a lyric, but in the powder keg of 1830 Brussels, it was a match. The audience didn't just applaud, they rose to their feet. The fervor in the theatre spilled out into the lobby, and then into the streets. The theatre crowd merged with angry workers outside. They started smashing windows, looting government buildings, and setting fire to the house of the Minister of Justice. King William sent in troops to quell the riot, but the street fighting only galvanized the population. What started as an opera revue turned into a revolution. Within months, the great powers of Europe convened in London and decided that, for the sake of stability, this riotous region should be its own country. Belgium was effectively sung into existence. If you're finding these stories of nations as fascinating as we do, and you want to support more deep dives into the strange corners of history, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really does help us keep the lights on and the research going. Now, while Belgium's birth was dramatic, Brazil's path to independence is perhaps the most ironic. It wasn't a war against a foreign colonizer. It was a family dispute over real estate. In 1807, as Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, the Portuguese royal family did something unprecedented. They packed up the entire court files, servants, treasure, and the Queen and sailed to their colony, Brazil. For over a decade, Rio de Janeiro wasn't a colonial outpost. It was the capital of the Portuguese Empire. But by 1821, Napoleon was gone. The Portuguese Parliament in Lisbon demanded their king return. He did, but he left his son, Dom Pedro, behind in Rio as regent. The Parliament in Lisbon, jealous of Brazil's new wealth and status, demanded that Brazil be demoted back to a mere colony and ordered Dom Pedro to come home immediately. Pedro was faced with a choice: obey his father's government or hold on to the power he had in the New World. On January 9, 1822, a day now celebrated as Dia do Fico, or I Stay Day, Pedro stood on a balcony in Rio, clutching a letter from the Portuguese court demanding his return. He announced to the crowd, "For the good of all and the general happiness of the nation, I am ready. Tell the people that I stay." It was a soft coup. By September of that year, he tore the Portuguese insignia off his uniform and declared independence or death. Brazil became an independent empire, not by overthrowing the royal family, but because the prince decided he didn't want to move back to his parents' house in Europe. However, if Brazil was a family drama, our final story is a feat of engineering and geopolitical strong-arming. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States, under President Teddy Roosevelt, was obsessed with one goal: connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The French had tried and failed to build a canal in the province of Panama, which at the time belonged to Colombia. Roosevelt offered Colombia a treaty to take over the project. The Colombian Senate, wanting a better deal and wary of American imperialism, voted it down in August 1903. Roosevelt was furious. He decided that if he couldn't rent the land, he'd just create a new landlord. Enter Felipe Bunavarilla, a French engineer who had a financial stake in the canal's success. Working from a hotel room in New York City, he helped coordinate a small group of Panamanian separatists. He provided them with a constitution, a flag his wife sewed, and assurances of American protection. On November 3, 1903, the rebels declared independence. Colombia tried to send troops to crush the rebellion, but when they looked out to sea, they saw the steel hull of the USS Nashville, a U.S. gunboat parked deliberately in the harbor to block their advance. The United States recognized the new nation of Panama on November 6, just 3 days after the revolt began. 12 days later, the new Panamanian government signed a treaty granting the U.S. total control over the canal zone. Panama exists in its current form largely because a global superpower refused to take no for an answer on a construction project. When we look at a map, we see rigid lines and sovereign colors. We assume they are permanent, ancient, and inevitable. But the stories of Singapore, Belgium, Brazil, and Panama remind us that the world is often shaped by the unpredictable, by tears, by arias, by stubborn princes, and by gunboats. It forces us to ask, if the nations we know today were born from such chaotic circumstances, what might the map look like tomorrow?
Case closed on this chapter, but the world is full of unsolved questions. Join the investigation by subscribing now.